As an example, with memory, the overhead for memory settings is actually based on the maximum setting, not the desired. That's because every LPAR has to have translation control entries for its page tables. So what they do is they take that maximum setting and divide that up by the LMB and do some other math, and they reserve that amount of system memory to do the real to virtual mappings for each LPAR. If you set your maximum settings too high, that can be significant. You should also look at where you're going to use shared or dedicated processors, where they're going to be capped or uncapped. And if they're not capped, then you need to look at the number of virtual processors. Never ever starve your VIO servers or your client LPARs. And also be very cautious about sizing studies. One of the things I found with sizing studies is that they tend to undersize memory and quite often the cores, because they forget about the fact that you also need to size that server to include what your VIO server will need. And one of the last things I want to mention has to do with scaling and sizing. When you're comparing boxes, you need to scale by RPerf or some other benchmark data, not gigahertz, because gigahertz in many ways is fairly meaningless, because RPerf is about how much throughput you can get, and all of the power servers are throughput-based machines. Also, do not size the box by the sum of the entitlements. I see this all the time where people have, 20, 30 LPARs, and they basically, if you sum up the entitlements, every core is in use. What that means is that your LPARs can't shrink and grow, because the whole idea is that you set the entitlement to what you're using a little bit above average, and then you have your VPs set to what you're going to peak at. Well, if all your LPARs peak at the same time and you size the box by entitlements, then you're not going to be able to grow and shrink, and you're going to have a lot of latent demand and some serious performance issues. So that's what I'm getting at here, where I say don't sum the entitlements. If you look at this system here, I have 4 LPARs, and I have the number of cores that I need, and they sum the entitlements, so they thought they needed 11 cores, but actually when you look at how they peak at noon, they actually really need 21 cores. Make sure that you understand how your workloads work. By default, there are some tunables that should be set on your system that are not set automatically. They are specifically the network tunables for RFC 1323 and TCP send and receive and UDP send and receive. And I have minimum levels here, but you should always tune those, because by default they are not tuned, and you have UDP traffic in your system even though you think you don't, because that's what things like the domain name servers, etc. use. I also tune my HBAs, and this is sort of a starting point that I use. You can go above 1024 if your disk subsystem supports it, and if your VIO server is set to at least that high. In order to set any of these fiber adapter settings, you must set them on your VIO server and reboot your VIO server first. If you don't do that and the LPAR ends up coming up with a higher value, the LPAR won't boot. I also tune the virtual buffers on my LPARs and on my VIO servers to make sure that I have enough tiny, small, medium, etc. buffers. So this is the default that I would use, where ENT4 and ENT5 are virtuals. You would need to check it individually for each of your systems. And you don't need to tune them on every system, just ones that have a lot of network traffic. In terms of the HBAs, I already mentioned this, but I actually make tuning changes on all of my LPARs and on my VIOs. There's also a max transfer size. The default is a 16 meg DMA. It turns out that under the covers at one of the levels they actually give you one anyway, but I always set it to a 128 meg DMA, and then depending on the adapter type you can sometimes check it high. You can change it to a higher value, which is the line that's 0x10 00000, and depending on the bus type you may get a 256 meg DMA or you may get 128 meg. This can make a significant performance change if you're running really, really large IOs. So I very rarely change it beyond the 128 meg DMA. And again, this is one where the VIOs must be booted with a setting the same or higher. So the next couple of sections I'm going to talk a little bit about CPU and memory. And we're going to start with entitlement and VPs. In Power 5, 6, 7 and 8 and Power 9, they use different utilization calculations for CPU. The VPs get unfolded sooner. From Power 7 and above, it's actually at lower utilization levels than it was on previous systems, which means that you may see some high virtual context, which is an LPAR stat, which tells you that you need to pay attention to your virtual processors. So starting with Power 7, you may see cores activated at lower utilization levels, but you'll see higher idle. And what they did was they basically changed things so that prior to Power 7, it would activate the first SMT thread on a virtual processor, then the second one, then the last two, then it would activate a virtual processor. But with Power 7 and above, what it does is it activates the primary thread on the first virtual processor, then on the next VP it activates the primary thread, etc., until all the VPs are used, and then it goes back and does the secondary threads and the tertiary threads. So just be aware of that. If you only are using SMT primary threads, you probably have too many virtual processors. So you can avoid this by reducing your VP counts, by using realistic entitlement to VP ratios, and the recommendation that I got from Nigel was that you sit around 0.6 to 0.7 of the VPs, so there's some numbers here that you can look at that you can use as starting points. We already talked about not letting workloads run above entitlement. And be aware that on your VIO servers, that entitlement is critical because it really impacts your SCAs. And the reason we're concerned about virtual processors is that every virtual processor has to be dispatched before one can be redispatched. So as an example, what I see sometimes is I'll see a shared processor pool, and let's say there's 20 cores in the server. They'll allocate 22 cores to the shared processor pool, which you shouldn't be able to do, or they'll give an LPAR more VPs than there are physical processors in the server or processors in the pool. So now all 22 of those have to be dispatched before you can go back and dispatch the first one, but you only have 20 cores to dispatch across. So just be aware that you really need to understand those things, because it will absolutely degrade your performance, because there will always be, in this particular case where I have 20 cores and 22 VPs, I'm always going to have 2 VPs waiting to be dispatched. Now, after you do an upgrade between technologies, you really should review your VPs and entitlements, particularly if you've got large LPARs. Depending on the architecture, you may have more threads and you may have more, well, you'll definitely have more RPerf per core. So something that might have needed 16 cores on one technology only is going to need maybe 12 on another technology. So that's something that you want to look at, is use your RPerf numbers to get an idea of relative performance and figure out what you really need after you do the migration and do some resizing. If you have too many cores or too many VPs, you're just going to waste dispatcher and hypervisor cycles. Now, with that said, if the LPAR with 16 cores is like running at 100%, then you have latent demand, so any resizing you probably should do after you migrate it, after you've had an opportunity to measure what it's now using. And this is just an example to show you what NMON would show for an LPAR that is actually running pretty much consistently above entitlement. You'll see that it's got 16 VPs, it has an entitlement of 10, and it's running somewhere between 12 and 14 most of the time. So this was affecting both its CPU performance and also its network performance. I mentioned earlier that LPARs can be capped or uncapped. If a capped LPAR is running, it can give unused cycles back and make them available for others, but it can never grow beyond what its entitlement is. An uncapped LPAR can go above its entitlement up to the size of the pool or the total desired virtual processors, whichever is smaller. And of course, unused capacity is always seeded back. So when you have a competition for CPU, 2 LPARs are requesting, let's say, 2 cores each or 3 cores each,